Without any further ado, it is my pleasure to invite the Prime Minister to speak to the motion before the House. Everything's good with the live stream?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
I guess just a general warning. I guess we are talking about a motion that is about a sensitive topic. So I mean, if this is something that I know people might have history with or might not be comfortable hearing about, obviously general warning before the debate or before my own speech. Just to let everyone know before we go through this one. So. Panel, I don't think the significant disagreement in this debate is going to be about whether or not mental health issues are inherently socioeconomic. I think teams in general will agree that insofar as mental health issues exist, these issues are likely to be influenced by large socioeconomic factors that happen to come into play. That is to say that if you're an individual that goes through a set of circumstances that have led to the deterioration of your mental health, you likely exist in a society in which these types of factors are normalized, or at least the society does not focus enough on stopping these factors from coming into fruition in the first place. I think in the interest of a fair debate, then, what this debate is actually about is even if the general causes of mental health are socioeconomic, there might still be valid ways for opposition to argue that the treatment and the narratives around this mental health treatment should be individualized, should be personalized in that regard. I think that's the general framing that exists for this debate. So, what do we stand for inside opening government? I think we in general view this debate as follows. I think we have to defend a world in which the general preference for mental health treatment, the discussion of mental health, and the discussion of the consequences of mental health, in general are focused on the socioeconomic roots of these problems, the general widespread applicability of these problems, as opposed to focusing on individual circumstances. We think this looks like, one, generally supporting more policies that take down a lot of the structural socioeconomic inequalities that cause mental health issues to begin with, but as well, the narratives around which we discuss mental health and the lack of individualized narratives versus focusing more on socialized narratives. Clarification? Clarification?
Yeah, you can't fiat more policies. You have to provide structurally
Sure. Okay, we will definitely discuss that as well, but I think that's going to be inherent in our argumentation as well. This is simply what we prefer in the context of this round. Another important piece of framing is this, very quickly, right? In general, we think both types of treatment and narratives are going to exist. We generally prefer narratives that are significantly more oriented towards socioeconomic roots of mental health issues. Insofar as there are super nuanced cases in which these are not applicable, we would obviously not say there would be no longer any existence of individualized treatment in general, just that our priorities should be focused in one direction instead of the other. That is the general framing of this case. Given that is the case, 2 points of constructive in this speech. One, the unique way that socioeconomic factors impact individuals with mental health issues. Secondly, how we get greater interest and awareness for mental health issues and greater support for policies that deal with mental health. One, talking about the uniqueness of socioeconomic factors that does not exist on side opposition. Notably, it is important to remember that there are significant amounts of causes of mental health issues that are simply beyond your control, that are simply assigned to you at birth, that are simply things that you cannot avoid as an individual. Your membership of a group that has historically been oppressed in your society is something that significantly deteriorates your quality of life, increases your stress, such as whether you go through racism or sexism or transphobia and a variety of these different things that exist. But note, this is not just limited to the experiences of people of color and people in equity-seeking groups, because insofar as we live in a hyper-capitalist society in which high focuses on success exist, high focuses on educational outcomes, prestigious jobs exist, you are likely to consistently be oppressed on the basis of your lack of economic outcomes as well. Lastly, we have socioeconomic phenomena that exist that normalize things that in general lead to more mental health issues. For example, a society that in general normalizes gambling and gives thousands of billions of dollars to large gambling companies probably structurally reinforces a lot of these factors as well. So, it is not sufficient for us to just prove that these things are inherently socioeconomic. Here's the reason why that is important for our side of the house. One, in general, isolationism as a focus of mental health is bad. What do I mean by this? I mean, one, if your internal narrative for how you process mental health issues is in general one in which you view your experiences as individualized, you feel isolated and you hold yourself accountable, you hold yourself culpable for the issues that you go through. This is less likely to happen insofar as our narratives surrounding the discussion of mental health are focused on how groups go through this collectively, how other people are in similar positions as you, and how a lot of these factors are beyond your control, they're not caused by you, and as a result you are more likely to seek out help on the basis of this. But Secondly, I think there is more nuance in the way you get your treatment for mental health. So it is not in general now, you go for a personalized treatment in which like psychologists or psychiatrists or counselors try to apply general treatment that exists in whatever medicine practice that they learned. I think in general what happens now is you have more discussion and more education of the specific ways in which maybe people of color go through mental health issues that are exclusive to them and are not just focused around general mental health strategies as a whole. This means we can actually co-opt the mechanism of more nuance in the treatment on our side of the house, which is something you cannot get. Closing.
What are the socioeconomic causes of postpartum depression?
I think that in general, we are not going to say that there are not issues that exist in which we specifically have, not personalized circumstances applying. But I think a response to that POI is that in general, given the prevalent sexism that exists, given the fact that significantly a lot of rich white men make laws around mental health services and resources for postpartum depression, I think it is very easy for us to say that this ingrained sexism means you get less policies to support mental health treatment for what you were just talking about on your side of the house. Secondly, greater awareness for mental health issues. I think the important thing is not just the internal narrative that changes on our side of the house. Because, note, the individualization of mental health means that people that do not go through significant amounts of mental health issues in their life do not feel like they have an active stake in the promotion of policies that help these individuals. This is no longer true on our side of the house. One, we talk about how society at large creates systems in which people go through mental health issues, so it is no longer just the problem of individuals that are going through mental health issues, but secondly, insofar as you see greater awareness, for example, of the fact that your specific minority group has a significantly higher percentage of mental health issues because of structural racism that exists in your society, you now have a stake in this issue, even if you were previously not someone going through a mental health issue. This is important for a number of reasons. One, this directly deals with what OO just talked about in their POI, about the ways in which we get political will for policies. Because note, now that the active group that lobbies for policies for better mental health is no longer just the people going through mental health issues, who in general might face structural barriers talking about their experiences. Now, it is also the individuals that are a part of these different groups, a part of the society in large, that have an incentive now to lobby for better policies. This means a number of things. One, we get more policies on our side of the house, because in general, you require more people to come into this narrative and have a discussion of how this works. But secondly, insofar as this is also a debate about the consequences, I would contend that a society in which there are many people going through mental health issues is not a society in which many people can meaningfully engage in systems of education, political participation, and general societal involvement. These are significant consequences of mental health issues that are now focused on, and we talk about the ways in which this impacts societies, and how societies are less able to function. So, even if you're a privileged person who has no caring for how people go through mental health issues, insofar as we focus on the consequences on society writ large, you now also have an incentive to lobby for better policies, better resources, and access to mental health resources on our side of the house. We create a narrative in which we have a significant ability to talk about inclusion, we talk about unity on our side of the house, and we dispel with this lie that mental health is an individualized problem. Mental health problems can only exist in societies that allow them to happen. As a result, I am so proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to welcome the Leader of the Opposition to begin the op bench. Here. Do you want to acquire that spare table more permanently?
Well, maybe I'll just use this one after my speech. Well, the speech one. No one is depressed because structural sexism exists. They're depressed because they have an individual dynamic with their partner and the people in their lives that allows them to treat them badly, to express that kind of sexism. And that is the thing that we want to solve in this debate. Not talking about the overall problem, but the ways in which those overall problems have affected your life. 3 contributions from opening opposition. First, why this is better for the individual's mental health care. Second, why this means we get more buy-in for mental health infrastructure. And third, why it is dangerous to assume that these strictly exist along lines of class and socioeconomic status. Let's start with why this is better for the individual. First, this is because it tells the individual that they have agency. When you are blaming a broad socioeconomic factor, it is incredibly unclear to the individual how it is that they are able to deal with that, which means you disempower them to actually make changes in their lives that are actually likely to create problems. This has two upshots. First, it means people simply do not adopt those strategies because they think, I am one person, how can I possibly take down sexism? And secondly, it just gives people hope. Even if it doesn't actually change something, it's incredibly important for people who are experiencing this to be able to go through hope. And no, they might want to talk about all the societal change that can exist. There isn't that much political capital for helping people with mental health problems at the government level. The vast majority of things that help people with mental health problems is them taking individualized action. We ought to tell them that they have the agency to do so. Secondly, I would point out that this largely just is caused by individualized factors. First, many mental health problems, in fact most mental health problems, are about your relationship with other people in your life. Second, it is often to do with your unique biology, like mental health problems are an expression of biological problems. And third, even to the extent that they are about societal factors, we point out that those societal factors are still expressed through your own personal history, because the fact that sexism exists is expressed through the personal history that you've had experiencing sexism with your partner. Third, even if it's true that there's both societal problems and personal problems, we would point out that personal problems are the ones that we are more likely to be able to solve. So if we have to focus on attacking one set of problems, we will focus on attacking the personal problems, because those are the ones that we can take down with things like conversations, rather than requiring the entire restructure of society to do so. Fourth, I would say that it is deeply insulting to people to say that their experiences are the same as everyone else, to say that they are just part of a big pool of people, all of whom are experiencing the same set of societal factors. People feel like their individual problems are individual. People feel like they're different to other people, and I would say that it is incredibly hurtful to them to say that you are the same. I know that often the particular strategies or the particular mental health outcomes are not the thing that will ultimately solve a lot of these problems or help people manage it. It's about them feeling like they are heard. It's about them feeling like they are part of a community that supports them. And it's unbelievably insulting to tell people that they are just part of one group of people, all of whom are affected the same way. Fifth, people are simply more likely to opt into care when it is individualized. First, this is because they feel that their individual problem is personal. People with mental health problems often feel that no one else is able to relate to them. They often feel that their problem is individual to themselves and no one else can hear them. And when you tell them that it is the same as everyone else, they're simply less likely to opt into mental health care in the first instance. And secondly, when you tell them that it's the same as everyone else, they're more likely to simply do things like read the internet or talk to other people who have experienced it, rather than seeking out individualized care. I would note that this is upstream of the rest of the debate, because it does not matter if they think their thing is better if no one opts into it, because they feel like that is not allowing them to be heard. Sixth, I note that this buys into the rhetoric that people experiencing mental health problems are in fact just the same as all other people and are just being, snowflakes about it. Because if you say it's about socioeconomic factors or racism that a large group of people experience, but then only some people have mental health problems with that, it buys into the rhetoric that tells people that, oh no, it's not actually a unique problem to you, you're just complaining about it more, you're just making a bigger deal out of it. But when we know that it is personal, you cannot buy into that. Yeah.
There are people in society that denounce the experiences of people that go through mental health by blaming them for their own problems. Your side, focused on individual actions, empowers them to do this more.
Yeah, okay, so the characterization of focusing on your personal problems that they're trying to push us on here is when you focus on people's personal problems, you blame them for those problems? No, we're not going to blame people for the problems. We're going to focus on the way in which your individual circumstances have caused it. The idea that our side is for blame and their side is not is an absolutely insane characterization of this debate. Seventh, I would note that this allows people in your life to obfuscate responsibility for what they have done to you, because they're able to say, oh, this was simply caused by those outside factors, and that means that they don't have to take accountability for what they're saying. Opening government here says you will feel isolated if it's an individual problem, but saying it's a personal individual problem doesn't say it isn't about your interactions with other people. It says it's about the individual interactions with people in your life. And I'd note, if our side is telling you this problem is caused by the individuals in your life, their side is telling you it's caused by broad society. Who is it easier for you to reach out to so you don't feel isolated? The individuals in your life. How are you going to reach out to the broad problem of sexism and talk to them about it? Clearly ours is the side that empowers people to talk to people in their lives more. Second contribution, why we get more mental health infrastructure. First, the first thing I want to note here is OG says, we would completely restructure society to fix these problems. The question is, how powerful is this narrative and how much change do they think they're going to be able to get? Because frankly, they're not going to get any of the change that they want to be able to get. Why is it that more people are going to buy into mental health infrastructure? The government will be more likely to fund mental health infrastructure with our narrative. That is first, because you do not have powerful groups lobbying against mental health infrastructure. It's unclear why a business wants to lobby against providing more therapist appointments or more visits to a psychologist. But on their side, if they want to say capitalism is the problem, we're working people too hard, then businesses are all going to lobby against those forms of change. So we actually get more change on our side. Second, this buys into the rhetoric that people are having to restructure their lives in order to fix other people's mental health problems, and that means that they're likely to not buy into this, they're likely to not support it, because people do not want that. Third, I note that often fixing these particular social and broader societal things have external harms. There's a reason that society is set up this way, for instance, for productivity, and that means that people aren't going to want to help these individuals because they feel like it is harming them as a consequence of that. And third, it tells me that people should not go to their own support, but people should focus on society. I note here, this is just more important than the rest of the debate, because it doesn't matter if one side is marginally better than the other at helping people. We explain why we get more investment in things like mental health infrastructure. Final contribution from opening opposition explains why it's dangerous to assume that class and race are the vectors upon which these problems exist. First, many people then who come from privileged backgrounds simply do not seek out things like mental health treatment, and there's no reason why we not care about a person just because they are wealthy, and telling people that they less likely to means many people don't go out and seek treatment. Even if that is true, not clear why we should tell people and freeze them out from seeking treatment. But secondly, you now stereotype people from lower class backgrounds as having those mental health problems. So, problems like behaviours that are seen as normal in privileged people are now diagnosed as mental health problems in disprivileged people. That looks like African Americans who express anger being told that it's more likely that they are bipolar. And that is significantly used to discredit them. Because you can say things like, oh no, I'm not being racist, I'm just acknowledging that person comes from a disprivileged group and therefore is more likely to have mental health problems. And that is used, first, people just assume they have mental health problems in the first instance, so treat them worse. But secondly, it's used as a cover. Look, obviously, in the vast majority of cases, people's problems come from their own lives. We're the ones who fix those problems.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now the Deputy Prime Minister up to continue the government bench. Here. Oh, yeah.
Alright. Again, hi mom. 2, 1. The first line we get out of Ello is that I'm not sure that structural racism or structural problems are the reason why people have any sort of depression or mental illness. Big contention to this idea. I have no idea if this is true. Here's why. A. There is active people that discount the belief of mental health in various forms on every single basis, and these people tend to be the ones that have the most sort of power in society. How do they do this? They co-opt the responses to mental health in ways like this. You are depressed? Go to the gym. You have ADHD? Focus more. It is your fault for suffering for these sorts of things. And note the nuance. We're not saying necessarily that on opposition, you as the forms of people who do these mental health supports are the folks who are reporting this narrative. Rather, that elites within society, the CEOs, the parents of people, the people who have power and influence are the ones that are going to co-opt this narrative and blare it out to children. This is the important nuance that gets zero engagement from opening opposition. Onto their case very promptly. Let's talk about what we get from all. On the first idea of like better mental health care and how you like access this, right? I want to note Vidit's framing, because it's not the case that on OG we don't get individualized sorts of mental health supports. We do. You still have like site charts that are drawn out for people. You still have individualized plans that treat people fairly. It's just the narrative of which these groups take and publicize themselves shifts substantially to be more focused on these sorts of socioeconomic factors. Because note, this is what you don't get on opposition. You don't get the decreasing of stigma, because when you don't have a reason for accessing these sorts of things and pushing out these narratives to society en masse, it still looks like the person who's mentally ill or has mental health issues that they struggle with is weird, is otherized, is someone that is someone that is a outlier as opposed to a norm or someone that can be affected underneath the structure of society broadly. So two impacts flow from this right away. negative impact is that you're more likely to feel like you are an other from the world and not access mental health supports on their side of the house because you don't get that narrative that it's not just you alone who faces this sort of thing. But positive impact is that their idea of buy-in needs the individual to not feel alone, to not feel otherized, to not feel like their story is something that can be discounted en masse. This is what we get. We get the ability for folks to engage with each other and to realize that they're not necessarily alone. And here's the nuance to and a bit of breadth to what they get. Because it's also not the case that we broadenize all of these mental health issues to say that everyone is the same. But rather it's to say that we have right now, things like large-scale gambling and large-scale drinking are still things that we attribute to societal factors that make them realize that it's more okay for them to opt out for support even if they have privilege or even if they have lots of levels of money because it's things that affect society overall. So this narrative goes both ways. It's likely not to be the one that stigmatizes people at the very bottom because it indicates a shift or at least an attempt to shift the narrative that affects the top level CEOs. So then how do we get to the elites? How do we access these sorts of things? And note the end of Vidit's speech. So I think this weighing is rather important and it's the same metric we get at the end of yellow. And it's the idea of productivity. Because note what Vidit says is that we're able to conflate these issues to have practical negative impact, like, oh, you vote less, you access school less, you work less, that make this issue of mental health suddenly substantially more important to folks who may otherwise believe there is no reason to give a shit about mental health and no reason to care about people feeling bad without any sort of nuance, because they then can see the actual practical harms. It's that you don't go to work, it's that you don't go to school, it's that you are treating people around you in worse sorts of fashions, and that it's attributed to an actual specific reason that may or may not be affected, or that is affected within societal structures that uphold these things. Okay, cool. POI from CL first.
Yeah, so you say that people will buy into caring about mental health more because now they can see how it affects society and therefore them. Do they not realize that we are all individuals in a society?
Okay, we are all individuals within a society. Great, but we're also all victims of the ways that society meanders big groups of people and not allows them to access these sorts of things equally. Sure, you may be individualized, but when you don't feel like that individualism has a support within that group network, it's further isolation. It feels like that same society doesn't want you to be there. It doesn't want to support you within these sorts of ideals. Okay, constructive. How do we weigh and how do we win out this debate? I think it's very simple. I think it's that you are able to actualize your modes of success in actual mental health supports, and you find comfort within this far substantially because you're no longer isolated within these sorts of things. To talk about their individualized mode of mental health that we get out of CO, like postpartum depression, note is that even if these things are individualized, the response to them isn't. Crucially, the way that people will treat postpartum depression will not be individualized. They won't care about your individual experience because they'll look at you as someone who suddenly stopped going to work, who just doesn't have an experience that they can relate to. So a lot of these things end up mattering within being a socioeconomic factor. It does matter to promote these things rather largely because then you create the incentive for folks who may not be within that in-group who can uniquely experience this sort of harm to understand, at least to some extent, perhaps there is a reason why we ought to put value towards these things within society. Here's the OG model reiterated, and here's how we plan on dealing with these things, and that is why our burden isn't going to be so huge, at least to the extent that it's made out to LO. Because note, don't let the other team strawman us into oblivion. It's not like us saying we're going to make massive policy shifts that affect the world en masse. What it is about these groups pushing out narratives that talk about the consequences of these things. Our burden is showing that we get more opt-in by groups that would otherwise not have cared about mental health in the first place whatsoever. It looks like what Vidit tell you. It's privileged sorts of people that otherwise don't have incentives to opt into the narratives of mental health that would be disenfranchised to the movement by choice, having to give a shit about the movement because it affects their bottom line. It affects the productivity they get at the end of the day. It affects the highest level of intellectual not coming to work because they struggle from sorts of things. It makes them a reason to give a fuck about people, and that's what's most important. OG.
Thank you very much for that speech. To wrap up the top half, we welcome the Deputy Opposition Leader. Hear, hear.
Ready? Starting in 3, 2, 1. If you believe that your mental health issues are a result of societal sexism, what are you going to do? If you believe that the reason that you are experiencing depression is because you are a person of color and there have been histories of intergenerational racism committed against you, what are you going to do? That's the problem for this government bench. they describe a problem, and they describe why focusing on that problem might, at an intellectual level, write for a better academic paper in uni. They don't explain why individuals are better with dealing with that problem. And that's why OWA will win the round. First thing I'm going to do in this speech is look at how do individuals react. Their essential claim is that individuals will feel more isolated in our world because it's you versus the world. 3 responses. 1, the types of narratives that they offer necessarily must be reductionist, because they must group people and they must say that all of these people experience a common thing as a result of society. That then offers no individual way for people to express their voice, for people to express their agency, for people to explain the way that they feel. That uniquely robs people of their agency within mental health. It tells individuals that because you are a person of colour, you suffer from this specific thing, and that your input on that is not as legitimate as the way, compared to the fact that society is structured in a given way. I think that compounds people's anxieties, it compounds people's depression, it makes them feel more isolated. We flip that. But the second response is to explain that they say you are now recognize that you're a part of a mental health community, but they never explain why that community is more meaningful. Often you might be separated by things like geography. You might not know who these people are. Just because I personally have anxiety does not mean that I relate heavily to every other person in this room that has anxiety. I relate to my partner and my friends who know why I have anxiety, who will listen to me when I am upset. They never explain why their community is more meaningful. That's why we flip it. But we flip this in a second way at opening opposition, because we uniquely explain why individuals on our side who have the most capacity to help you, which is your friends, which is the people who you surround yourself with, now have the most ability to also help and engage with you. We explain that when there are narratives about individuals, it then provides a set of reasons, the narrative takes the form of individuals have personal causes for mental health. You are most proximate to them. You can help them most, and they can definitely come to you in the first place. That means that these individuals are better actors, because for the reasons that Matt explains, they cannot obfuscate their responsibility to help you, because there is a greater onus on people to, and that means that they proactively, because they care about you, become better actors in your life. That's why individuals do not feel less isolated. Second issue in this speech on the quality of treatment. Before I go on, closing government, do you have anything?
It's not great for your case to run they're all the same, or your psychiatrist will no longer prescribe meds. Would you like to engage in a more charitable version of the narrative?
I don't think we ran that. I think I explained why your side is the side that runs that. So maybe I'll take you later if you want to refine that POI a bit better. Secondly, on treatment, the way that you ought to analyse this is to ask yourself the question, do people have better access? And then secondly, what is the quality of that treatment? The reason why we will win this issue in opening half is because we will explain why people are more willing to opt in and why the quality of treatment is then therefore better, which compounds the benefit of people opting in the first place. No, this opening government team wins neither, but even if they only win one, that's not a benefit for them. So, what do they say? They essentially have 2 mechanisms here. The first mechanism is on buy-in. And they say that the ordinary person now feels like they have a say because they are a member of a society. Just think about how ridiculous of an argument this is. Currently, people understand that mental health problems are incredibly individualized. They are the idea that everyone experiences them. It is a struggle that we can all relate to. On their world, you say, well, individuals who are from X group are disproportionately more likely to experience it. Matt explains there are a series of problems with that. Firstly, that individuals from higher privileged groups are less likely to even talk about their mental health, or they're more likely to dismiss it in the first place. Their assertion at DPM is to say, no, obviously we can talk about gambling too, but obviously that's something that disproportionately affects poor people, and even it affects everyone equally, it's still like a rich person probably has a lot more capital, so they never come forward in the first place. But secondly, Matt explains why individuals probably see their mental health, or at least individuals are told that their mental health is a necessary sacrifice. Because in our world, you can say things like, well, if you're experiencing things like depression, or we can look at the internal causes for that, or we can look at the ways that you personally experience that. In their world, the narrative is, you experience depression because we live under a system of capitalism, and unfortunately, that is a necessary sacrifice that you are predisposed to and that we must make. Because no one wants, or no one has the capacity or the ability to erode capitalism, to undo centuries of racism, to remove societal discrimination, and that uniquely explains why individuals are far less comfortable, both ordinary individuals and individuals experiencing mental health, actually addressing them. The final thing I'll talk about is more specific treatment. I don't have time. So, more specific
specific treatment. They say people can engage with this better because now it's like if you're a person of colour, we look at person of colour depression. They're doing the same thing that we are, but worse. Because now therapists just ask you, as a person of colour, how have you experienced depression? That means that the barriers to entry for therapy in their world is way worse because you don't get the immediate outcome. That means that individuals do opt out at an earlier point. The solutions to mental health are more blanket, and that means that individuals are more isolated because mental health and mental health infrastructure is less likely that something that individuals can opt into. It is then when individuals feel like they have no other place to turn to, especially in a world that emphasizes society rather than the capacity of your friends. The final thing I'll do is engage in some weighing, which is just that obviously we've explained why people's ability to seek this out gets better. We've explained, also the final thing I'll do is there stigma. Obviously stigma's worse in their world because for the reasons that Matt explains, you point to a specific group and say, you're affected by this, as opposed to it being seen as an issue that everyone is affected by. So, let's deal with the weighing for this round. First of all, we explain why individuals, even if they have no support structures, can handle their mental health better, because gains on an individual level are easier. Secondly, we explain why the actors that have the greatest capacity to help you, that is your friends and family, are most able to now and are better in our world. And thirdly, we explain why society is more likely receptive to your needs, is more likely to introduce infrastructure that is of a better quality that you are more likely to opt into. Because of these things, we necessarily cater to individuals with mental health, not just by directly addressing them, but explaining at a societal level why every actor with capacity increases and their incentive to increases. This is the biggest contribution in the debate. It most directly helps these people, it most directly addresses the problem, and it addresses it in the most effective way without isolating these people, without removing their agency, without them making feel like they are stigmatized or should be ashamed. Oh.
Thank you. That's going to get everyone in the top half. We'll let these guys jump out. And we'll now welcome the government member to begin the closing half of today's debate. Here.
At the top of this speech, I want to make something very clear, and that is that this narrative is just true. The rates of depression among boys is much, much higher because society says you ought not to express yourself and enforces norms of toxic masculinity. Class means that your parents often weren't there when you were a child, couldn't look after you, and means you might be predisposed to a lot of mental illnesses. There is a chronic underdiagnosis of mental illnesses in lower income and poor African American communities, for example, because of a lack of trust in government and in their services. So at the top of this speech, realize already that this narrative is true, or at the very least it can be painted to be true, which means that it is in fact effective and that O is already starting to fall out of this debate. But the second thing I want to note is that this isn't just about generically how we talk about illness, but about the fact that we can preemptively start to target things and identify at-risk groups we can actually provide services to. So CG will come into this round very cleanly by explaining, one, how you can provide services dealing with the very uncharitable frame from OO, and second, why the narrative is nice, again dealing with the very uncharitable frame from OO. What is therapy like? No thank you. The claim from OO is this. You go to a therapist and they say, well, let's see, so you're a woman, let's talk about sexism generally, and once we agree that that's a problem, then you're good, get out of the way. But I don't think that's true, right? I think you go, you say, and they say, well, the history of sexism that might have affected you is important. Let's talk about how that affected you as a person, acknowledging that there was the societal force that made you more susceptible to this, and going to the therapist to talk. I'll do a couple of quick pieces of refutation then. One, they say that they give people hope. This is missing a link because it's not clear how they actually are able to access therapy on their side. Instead, it's contingent on a later layer of their argument, which they don't prove, which is that you're unlikely to opt into care on our side, but will in theirs. But the reason that's unlikely is because our narrative says you're not fundamentally strange as an individual for having these things, that you're predisposed, that there are a lot of societal forces that made this more likely. That means that you don't feel the stigma that causes lots of people in their world not to access therapy in the first place. And the final thing is on the response claim on stereotypes. I just don't think this is true. If you say you are depressed because you're a woman, that is still offensive it doesn't matter that you're talking about mental health. It's still offensive. So the same forces that say, don't be offensive, are the ones that prevent you from being stereotypical. No. The first part of the constructive, then, is on why this narrative is compassionate. I think there are two big things to note. One, the people that control this narrative are medical professionals and advocates for groups like the low-income communities. The reason being, A, these are the people we trust when it comes to consulting people for legislation for the types of things we want to solve. It's the same reason why when it comes to something like mental health, we don't go to generals and say, what do you think about this? You go to mental health experts and individuals that actually have control. But second, you have an incentive to make it this way because I think that society largely acknowledges that mental health is important and it is desirable to fix. Even on the right wing, for example, I think these are still a group that says, like, well, mental illness is probably a large cause of like shootings, for example. So at the very least, there's an incentive on that side of the aisle to address this as well. Second, I think people care at some level. The reason being, this is a group that is vulnerable in a lot of cases, and it paints them as particularly vulnerable. So it interacts with an existing narrative that these are groups that ought to be prioritized. Narratives that racism and misogyny, for example, are cruel forms of abuse. The important thing is that maybe not everyone buys into this, but there is already a large swath of society that does, so activating all these narratives means that it is likely to be compassionate, because we've already spent decades, for example, telling people that they ought to be compassionate to these issues in the first place. So, going on to the second part of this extension, it is easier to identify at-risk groups and to provide support to them. There is a desire to target people with mental illnesses so we can provide them with effective treatment. So governments can provide therapists, for example, to primary schools in low-income communities where parents are often working and therefore not present at home and can't form the important relationships with children that need them to have a good life, right? These are types of policies that you are likely to see that are targeted and exist in our world that can exist in the absence of the view that these are things that are arbitrary and random in the way they affect individuals. So why do societal narratives make service provision far more likely on our side? There are a couple of reasons. One, this creates shared interests across social advocacy groups. These groups now begin advocating for the same thing. So the idea is that mental health groups and social injustice groups, for example, both want the same thing. So they want so they have resources that they can collectivize now in order to be able to target the issues of mental health as well as social injustice. The reason being that that the root causes and the underlying causes are things that are very similar. Second, I think that this lowers the cost for service provision massively to governments and social advocacy groups. Before that, yeah.
Are you suggesting that mental health advocacy groups will politically align with far-left social support groups?
The claim is that the groups are both targeting the same issue. It's that they are cooperating. The cooperation looks like devoting resources to the same area, maximizing the efficiency of those areas. It doesn't matter if they have the same political stance. What matters is that money is going to the same area, maximizing the effectiveness of money, irrespective of social stance. Second, so continuing on this, the stance of governments in the world of opposition is that these types of issues are ones that are arbitrary. So you need to provide individual sets of services to account for the unique sets of circumstances faced by every single individual that exists in society. I don't think that this happens at a high rate, the reason being that there is a huge cost to be able to provide this set of provision. But now you can preemptively target communities in ways that reduce that cost. And the important thing is, the trade-off here is really important. Governments have limited resources in the way that they allocate to mental health institutes, but spreading them across individuals for a variety of risk factors makes this much, much harder. When you say that there are societal issues, and you can provide it to things like schools, for example, you can provide it to particular low-income communities, that makes targeting much, much easier, and you can preemptively do so, which massively increases the effectiveness, because not every single new individual that is born into society needs a new set of toolbox, but the fact that you can address this social environment that they are born into means that you double the effectiveness of that provision. Third, pressure is larger for government to take action. I think the first thing is that some people generally start to feel guilty as though they are responsible in some way for the difficulties that other people feel. Second, people just feel far more susceptible. Instead, I'll suggest that I couldn't possibly ever be mentally ill because I'm me and this could never affect me. This is communal and breaks that narrative. The key is not just that they agree with you, accessing like the rich people stuff, it is that they become a powerful interest group that can actually advocate effectively toward government. So it's not just that they feel susceptible, but that they care about government changing things, right? They say businesses will lobby against you. I think the societal cost of saying I'm against mental health is very high, but more than that, businesses probably want their employees not to be totally depressed so that they can be effective employees. But finally, I think the bias is just worse in their world, because people blame you as a person, that you are individually responsible for the things that are affecting you, and that is much more isolating and much more difficult to treat. What are these sets of impacts here? One, we access preemptive care, and it's easy because you can target at-risk groups. The importance of preemptive care here is that it doesn't just affect people now, but people that are at risk and are born into these communities and can now be targeted at a higher level. So we reduce the net amount of mental illness rather than just having societies continually born in where 50% or something like that are meant to be ill. This is really, really important we solve on that basis.
If you don't want it, I'll take it. Do you want the desk?
I want the desk.
I'll push it back when you go.
There's a desk there with nothing but crap on it. Can I just take all this crap?
That's
We could do an exchange. Yeah, do you want a desk?
Oh, if you took their desk, isn't that just derivative? Eric, sorry, whenever you're ready, I'd like to welcome the opposition member. Here.
Well, government bench could be correct that it was demonstrably true that the cause of mental health issues are in fact socioeconomic issues. However, there are lots of things that are demonstrably true, such as the seas are rising, such as slavery was a problem in the United States of America. And the reason why we don't treat those things with the respect that we ought to is because these issues have become political hot buttons. And that is precisely what this government bench does to the issue of mental health. They turn it from something that we can all look at from behind a veil of closed doors and say, this is people dealing with their own problems, anyone in my family could be depressed, to something that says, if you're depressed, it's because of the hierarchy, it's because of societal structures, it's because of this left-wing academic bullshit that I don't buy into. And what that does is it locks approximately 50% out of the world of ever funding mental health or ever accessing mental health in the first place. As you can imagine, I think that impact is pretty significant and we'll take CO the debate. Let's get into it. We think that there are two major consequences of politicizing mental health. Firstly, it means that the right wing is going to discredit the entire field of mental health support. And secondly, it gives you reason to discount specific issues within mental health, even if you buy into the broader field. Let's begin by talking about discrediting all mental health. Notice that you have to believe in systems of oppression to buy into mental health problems now. There are a number of reasons for this. The first reason for it is that it is likely that the left-wing version that we hear from this government bench will be the dominant characterization coming from the medical community. There are three reasons for this. Firstly, the medical community is characterized by wealthy individuals who are highly educated. This is a group that is overwhelmingly liberal, and what's important to note is that even if you believe they are 70% liberal and not 100% liberal, that 70% forms an academic consensus that then informs the output of 100% of professionals. Secondly, it's just proven, like the left-wing stuff is a fact, like it is a fact that black people suffer from racism. It's not something that people who actually spend the time learning about this stuff are going to dispute. And thirdly, just as this government bench have done, even the parts that aren't related to socioeconomic forces are very easy to paint as being related to socioeconomic forces. Like postpartum depression is very clearly a personal medical issue that has nothing to do with society, and yet the Prime Minister was able to explain it to you as being a consequence of sexist doctors. Like, it is very easy to twist and turn everything into this left-wing narrative once the ball has started to roll. CG framed this as the compassionate version, so I imagine they're not going to contest this too much. But the important note here is that that means that the dominant picture of the mental health community will be an overwhelmingly left-wing academic community. Secondly, notice that after that, you then have to acknowledge these systems in order to support mental health support. Because if you're willing to support someone's mental health, like their depression, something like that, that means you have to either allow them to buy into that broader academic system of those medical health professionals who will treat them in that fashion, or you have to acknowledge the underlying systems of oppression that affect them in order to help them. It turns mental health into an acknowledgement of highly politicized issues. Thirdly, notably that you have strong incentives to do a lot of this stuff, not only from the position of you are in an existingly politicized structure and therefore you're likely to opt out of it, but also because you can actively weaponize it against the left. It's very easy to turn it into the left are all a bunch of big crybabies. It's very easy to turn it into the left are buying into this wackadoodle conspiracy theory. Somehow, the president being a man gave me anxiety. It's very easy to paint these things in ways that stoke up your base and get you more votes. Notably, in a lot of electoral systems, that becomes the clincher. It becomes your ability to turn these hot button issues into the sole point of discussion, particularly on the right, given that they don't have any actual fucking policies to turn to. But fourthly, notably that this will be seen as a left-wing thing. And look at the analysis of closing government, right? Like, mental health groups are now going to align themselves directly with, like, racial action groups, like feminist action groups. They're going to politically paint themselves as being from the same lobby, being from the same bracket. What does all of this mean? It means that mental health becomes the left-wing thing. If you're left-wing, great. If your state now supports it even more because they're left-wing and it's politically popular, that's awesome for you. But on either side of the house, you're going to be able to access that mental health support in the left-wing state. The problem is it's all the right-wing states, it's all the right-wing countries, it's all the right-wing districts, where now these get chronically underfunded. Schools teach people that mental health is bullshit. You're not depressed, you're sad for a day. You undermine the entire notion of mental health in the first instance. Before I move on, I'm very happy to take something from closing.
Does the right wing right now feel susceptible to the issues of mental illness, given that it's painted as individual and that is beyond?
Yeah, they totally do, right? Like, for the reasons that both benches so far have provided, which are there are independent reasons to support mental health. You want your company to work hard, and you don't want them to be depressed while doing so. It gets you easy PR points. People have people in their life who are mentally ill, which means that you need something additional that sets above reason and rationality to push people into not supporting it. And it's exactly politicization. It's why we don't fund school curriculum in the United States the way that we ought to. It's the reason why we don't fund climate change support, because people are willing to stick their heads in the sand as soon as something becomes a left-wing cause. But next, even if you don't buy that and people still buy into the idea that people can be depressed, can be anxious, can have OCD, the problem is that you now attack specific functions of that mental health. Which is to say, if someone is depressed and they say they're depressed because of societal injustice, you fucking attack that person. That person becomes your enemy, which leads to a whole set of attacks on those people. But more to the point, you also attack specific chains of mental health that are more primarily associated with specific politicized elements of it. Perhaps on either side of the bench, like Parkinson's remains relatively unaffected, but depression sure as hell won't when every poor person is depressed and every rich person doesn't have a claim to being depressed in the first place. So, that's the consequence of it. The counterfactual is treatment that exists behind closed doors, issues that exist behind closed doors, things that aren't politicized, that gets cross-bench support for supporting mental health. What's the impact of this in the debate? Two things. Firstly, mental health is not only not funded, it's actively attacked in contexts where it's politically useful to do so. Imagine what Texas looks like after this policy. Note how all of this material knocks closing government out, because they rely on these groups having the support of governments, or governments directly funding these initiatives in order to get any of their benefits. In a context where 50% of the world is totally unwilling to do it and willing to legislate against it, that isn't going to happen. But secondly, it also means that very much beyond governments and institutions, people just don't seek help. Opening opposition suggests that it's because people don't feel hope for getting better or well, or like they won't do it for that reason. It's a much better reason to believe that you just don't believe in mental health problems in the first place. You're politically opposed to the idea of seeking help, and you're willing to stop your children from doing it. You're willing to stop your nieces and nephews from doing it, because just like getting trans-affirming surgery, you view it as a politically oppositional thing to do. Note how this material weighs us into the round. Two ways. Firstly, note how it affects every issue in this debate, whether it's about seeking treatment, whether it's about the nature of the treatment that you provide, whether it's about the proliferation of that treatment. Our material becomes logically prior to all of that. But secondly, notably it affects the people with the highest margin of change. A, people who require government assistance for support, people who are locked out otherwise, and B, right-wing people who would otherwise need to be convinced to get this support. We have the largest impact, and the impact that is both most certain and most subject to change in this debate. Clear closing opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now to wrap up the government bench, we welcome the government whip. Here. Let everyone to come in. You want to come in now? Come in quickly. Oh, I thought you were waiting to come in.
No.
Oh, okay. There were people last week.
This whip will be structured in a really straightforward way. I'll talk about OO first, then OG, then CO. So, first on OO. The first thing to note is what I was trying to get at in the POI, which I admittedly did not phrase very well. And what I was trying to say was that they rely to a large extent on an uncharitable, unrealistic characterization of how these narratives will be presented without analyzing why they're the most likely way in which structural reasons will be presented. They involve two main things. First, the idea that if you belong to a group, that pressures affect you all in the same way, and second of all, that this transfers to the way people are treated. That is to say, that therapists will try to target societal factors when they're trying to treat you, as opposed to looking at your problem specifically and trying to solve those. Two sets of responses. The first is, I think Isaac explains to you why it is the case that framing the reasons for mental health in this way restores dignity as opposed to taking it away. And this is true for two reasons. The first thing, he explained that a lot of advocacy groups will have a lot of agency when it comes to perpetuating this narrative. And that is because they're the ones who have a large stake in explaining what the causes and what the consequences of mental health are. So for those reasons, definitionally, they talk a lot about why this is the case, and they don't say you're all the same. Instead, they talk about relationships and experiences that every person in this group can relate to. But second of all, it's also true because racism, sexism, all of these factors exist on either side of the house. The issue on their side is that this manifests on individual ways. So for example, they look at you, and because they have subconscious biases that mean that they see you as a woman as less able to resist the effects of stress, and that therefore you're oppressed, and that means that your treatment is therefore very, very hostile. On the comparative, when people acknowledge explicitly that there are structural causes behind this, one, healthcare professionals and other people in your life are more likely to acknowledge these factors when they're talking to you, therefore making you feel more comfortable about the stigma. But two, it also makes it such that you're able to incorporate these factors when they're talking about what your personal treatment plan should be. And this takes me to the second set of responses then, which is I want to make it very clear that there's a distinction between treatment, which is what O is talking about, and advocacy and policy, which is, I think, what CG is talking about, which I think is a lot more affected by these kinds of narratives than treatment is. Treatment is insulated from narratives about the causes and consequences of mental health writ large because they're run, like plans are determined by healthcare professionals. Because when a patient rocks up to your clinic, for example, they are paying for a service and that service is, I currently feel quite bad, or I suffer from the effects of ADHD or anxiety or depression, and I want to feel better. That means that you take the path of least resistance when it comes to prescribing treatment, no matter what you think the intellectual cause of this might be. Obviously, no one says, let's go and solve the issues of structural racism, or because I can't solve sexism, therefore I can't help this patient. Maybe you acknowledge that this contributes to them, but you prescribe them the Wellbutrin or the Prozac or whatever on either side of the house. So for those reasons, I think that we mitigate a lot of the OO case or turn it entirely. I also think that the analysis that Isaac provides also does a lot to outweigh OG. And this is because of two main things. The first thing is, a lot of their analysis on why individuals are more likely to seek treatment or will feel less stigmatized as a result of this narrative are hung on the assumption that this will be presented in a positive way, which I think OO challenges to a large extent. Isaac beats that, we also fill this analytical gap in OG as a result. But second of all, I'll take you in a sec, please. And also, they talk about how society becomes better in terms of increasing awareness and also in terms of collective interest. The issue there is that they do a lot of rhetoric and explanation that interest is good, but not much terminalization or uniqueness analysis. Because on either side of the house, as CEO says, they also care about increasing treatment. They will probably also talk about why mental health is important. The thing that Isaac provides is explaining why emphasis on a structural reason especially is really important, because that allows us to prescribe preemptive treatment plans and programs to catch people in high-risk groups without forcing them to reach out first. That's really important because of two things. The first thing is, we explain that this significantly reduces the cost of really valuable programs that help identify vulnerable kids who might be experiencing these pressures in the first place. They can't propose these kinds of policies on the same scale because they would have to provide these services to every single person because each of these things are individual. I think for those reasons, we're able to provide a lot more treatment. Before I go any further, I'll take opening.
You won't get your highly individualized, non-individual version of this narrative because mental health narratives in society are famously misunderstood, unnuanced, and reductionist because of stigma and because people don't understand, which is why people feel hopeless, which is why they don't opt in the first instance.
The idea that there's under-nuance is really symmetrical on either side. Isaac tells you that actually focusing on structural societal reasons places the control more in the hands of people who might have an understanding of these forces and therefore actually alleviates her problem. Finally then, on CO, and their extension is really cool. It's about the politicization of mental health. So I'm not going to challenge that this narrative is more aligned with left-wing's understanding of injustice. This is probably true. Where their argument fails, though, is in three places. The first thing is on uniqueness. And the first reason for this is because it is already true that people perceive mental health advocacy as more aligned with left-wing people independent of this narrative. Because it clashes with ideas such as you can always change the circumstances in your life, or things such as you can pick yourself up, for example. But second of all, also because unfortunately it is the case that their own analysis means that people living in New York City, for example, or in relatively metropolitan liberal places already have more access to mental health diagnoses, and therefore the people talking about their experiences online are also more liberal left wing, which means that all of their claims in terms of like this creates a perception that mental illness is left-wing is already true. But second of all, it's also the case that they fail to acknowledge the nuance and the ability to self-select into narratives across a country, because it's not the case that there's one bureau of left-wing woke people who then decides how everything works, but rather that there are different advocacy groups within different regions. I think it's the case that you can identify structural causes that are independent of CRT, for example. So, for example, by saying look, boys are people, the feminist movement, for example, is leaving behind boys. This means that boys have anger issues at a disproportionate rate, for example, and I think this is quite likely because of the specialization of treatment groups. But third of all, they also assume that this kind of discrimination is sufficient to preclude policy, but that's not true for two reasons. The first thing is, no matter what, doctors and medical professionals will still be necessary in these places, and therefore in the same way that they had some say in COVID, even though politicians were abandoning them, they also have some influence here. The second thing to note is that we think we shift the Overton window over time, i.e., when we start saying these things and we do implement these treatments in some parts of, say, red counties, and this creates results, you then enable other people to push this across the country as well, thus resolving the issue of left-wing bias. Happy to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now, to wrap up this debate and the Octofinals, we'd like to welcome the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
I want to start by making three observations about our extension. The first is it explains a categorically larger set of harms than any other team in this debate. That is, we don't attempt to just prove why mental health systems are more effective in one way or less optimized another way, but we explain why mental health, the people who suffer from it and its activists, are now faced with hatred when it's tied up politically, why they're more likely to be the victims of hate crimes or violence or other kind of culture war artifacts, which are active harms, and that alone should already be the clearest way to kind of decipher where the biggest changes are. Secondly, we point out that much of the other material in this debate seems to be able to be reasonably claimed by all teams if you read it like a little bit charitably. Like from OO, now your mum, partner, and your friends focus on you rather than society. Like obviously we agree with them and that's a benefit. But to some degree you would already expect your mum, friends, and family to be more focused on you, even if there is a push to be more societal. And on the other government side, we can now tie our benefits to winning social causes like housing reform without explaining either why, for the reason that, precarity, that leads to mental health issues, without explaining either why mental health activists make the difference in terms of achieving any of those policies, or why you would need to attach your mental health to those things in order to enjoy a benefit where they are achieved already. So that explains a lot of similarity in between the other three teams in this debate, while our extension is able to come over it. And the final thing I want to point out is our extension is one of the only ones that persists in every context. That is, a lot of the arguments in this debate work in one environment, like, where mental health is popular, attaching it to a winning cause can make that winning cause more effective, or in another environment where your mental health is unlikely to be treated well, it might be good to have your parents focus more on you. But we explain why in any context where there is political controversy, that is, left and right divides exist, which is essentially everywhere, politicizing it creates an additional set of harms. What that should make you believe is if I can defend the three tiny responses we get from closing government, that extension should be sufficient to take the debate. What does closing government give us to try to rebut the extension? The first thing to say is, it's not unique. It's already true that mental health is seen as a left-wing issue. Firstly, this is a preferred debate. It's irrelevant whether in the status quo some people already see it that way. What we explain at Member is that these like this alignment is the reason why that could be true in the status quo or why it would get worse. Secondly, obviously that's just mitigation. Like we'd point out our reasons give you the strongest reason to think you'd be aligned with left-wing activists if you're a mental health person, as opposed to just like assuming that mental health is always seen as left-wing. The second response they give us is, well, you can just phrase mental health in conservative ways, and that avoids the problem of being associated with the left wing. First, just sense check that. Like, conservatism is all about, like, being entirely self-reliant. Like, it's all about, you know, dealing with your own problems and stuff. Very unclear exactly how you can phrase these things conservatively. No, thank you. And secondly, we'd point out that all the reasons in our extension which don't get any, like, direct response explain why, even if you phrase things conservatively, you're more likely to be viewed as left-wing. And it's unclear exactly why just saying, oh, you know, we're going to phrase things more conservatively would make the difference. It's completely unproven. But thirdly, their only other response then, thirdly, is that no matter what, like some people will, that's right, no matter what, doctors are always there. So even if you're associated politically, you're still going to avoid like the problems we described. To which there are three responses. Firstly, that doesn't get around all the harms we describe, like mental health being impugned with hatred and a culture war is clearly still a harm, even if the infrastructure is still there for the doctors to help you, like the additional harm is being hated by society. Secondly, we point out those doctors need to be funded in order to be accessible, so no, they're not always there. Being politicized is a deathly harm. But thirdly, we point out that even if the doctors are still there, you need people to actively want to go and seek that help. And we explain that when things are politicized, you isolate an entire group of people who might not agree with it politically or have now like political reasons to not engage. That deals with the only response we get, the only response we get to our extension, and I've explained why that extension should be debate winning. OG.
In general, people with mental health do not go seek help as a result of stigma. Your OO already concedes that on our side, you're more likely to talk to people within your community, which is often a necessary step to get help in the first place. Knife your OO or clarify why that isn't true.
No, because your community is likely to have similar political views to you.
Yeah.
So that's not a good POI. Alright, the next thing I'm going to do is CG. Their claim is essentially this. We tie mental health to things which other people are going for, and that's a great benefit. But there are two problems with that. First, our extension proves that this cuts both ways, right? So where mental health gets tied to the winning horse, like, sure, you now get to claim it as a win for mental health. But equally, where mental health is tied to something which is controversial, and notably and importantly, we actually give you reasons to think this is going to be seen as controversial, you take on additional political opponents. So it's actually unclear, even if you buy their extension, that they like succeed in more cases than they take on additional harms. But my second response is going to break that symmetry, because I'll point out that mental health activists are unlikely to be the tipping point for like solving the precarity that leads to mental health or dealing with like racial issues, right? Notably, mental health activists aren't like a movement, like they're not a lobby, they don't have much money. It's very unclear that just putting them on the same team as the leftists achieves everything that the leftists want. And we would note that like, even if you don't believe that, where the cause of your depression is something like precarity, and you think that that precarity can be solved in other ways, for instance, that's why I said stuff like housing reform, it's unclear you need to know that the cause of your depression was socioeconomic in order to still enjoy the benefit. That is, if you believe that mental health should be tied to the winning horse, the claim here is the winning horse can succeed, and you didn't even need to know that that was the problem in order to still enjoy the benefit. So it's very unclear what closing government is actually trying to get at there. But the final thing I'll note here on closing government's material is the loss of any support where things are more controversial is clearly a much bigger harm than getting attached to the winning horse. I explained why mental health activists getting behind something is not going to be the difference. And that's also the reason why mental health activists having to face culture war, having to face the conservatives is such an enormous harm. And it draws everything my member told you. Finally, let's deal with OG. The easiest way to beat them is to prove that a lot of their arguments are circular. Like one argument is, well, we like improve mental health because we show it's connected to society and people care about issues in society. And the other stuff is like, oh, well, we improve society by fixing mental health and people care about mental health. Like, they're just two sides of the same coin. Those aren't mechanisms. But secondly, I'm going to deal with the only other mechanism they give, which is elites can't avoid responsibility now and give bad advice. One, how do elites give the bad advice? Like, they don't control the psychologists and the therapists. Secondly, elites are already culpable in other ways where that's important. It's unclear that also showing that they are bad for your mental health makes a difference. And thirdly, it's unclear why anyone cares about what the elites think. Like, our case is about how you weaponize those people to be politically against you, Their case is just, well, now they don't have as much of a platform to tell you that your mental health doesn't matter. We say people aren't listening to them, but they do become important at the point where you make them your political enemy. For those reasons,